This is Crossing Phase, the first podcast featuring a Christian and a Muslim talking religion and politics. My name is Matt Hawkins. I'm a former policy director for the Southern Baptist Convention, and my friend John Pinna is an executive director and founder of an organization called Muslims for Muslims. And this podcast of ours is a collaboration between muslimsformuslims.org and Roll Top Productions, which is my little thing over here. And joining us today is a special friend of ours, going back many years. We'll get his introduction here in a moment. But John Pinna, welcome. How's life in upstate New York?
It's interesting. We just had remember our podcast on the pillory in front of the police station, the Kingston police station?
Yeah, I do.
They took it down.
They took it down. Interesting.
It's gone now. And I talked to one of my friends that was a detective over there, and he goes, I'm not going to say you're responsible, but no one was thinking about it before they heard it on the podcast. So, I don't know. I'm going to say that's,
find out why they actually took it down.
So I think it was probably rotted, but from the bottom up. But I'm going to call that a crossing face win. No pillories should be in front of. No shaming should be in front of the police stations. We're recovering here from a few hurricanes. So yeah, that's been the big news up here. So a number of trees have fallen down, and I've been indentured to my father for years. So I was out with the chainsaw.
You got to be careful with those things. I do some chainsaw work for my father-in-law.
Here's the problem, is that it fell on the apple tree. And the apple tree is something that my father, this tree has been a hassle since we planted it 100 years ago. And so I had to cut around it. And now we'll put up a picture on the, what's it called? Now it's like propped with all these.
Oh no. Things. You knocked over the apple tree, John.
Yeah, so the apple tree it may not make it, but I tried my best to save it. I cut around it, and now it's ready to rock. So we'll see, but we'll post some pictures of a faith-based engagement to save ecology and the environment.
Right. So joining us today is Andrew Bennett, who we will soon learn of all the numerous titles that go before your name. We met him in the context of him being the first ever ambassador for religious freedom for Canada, which means we have someone who's either more of a northerner on our podcast than John Pinna is now. Andrew Bennett, welcome to Crossing Phase.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks, John, as well. It's great to be with you both.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. It's very, very gracious of you to participate. And before we got started, we agreed we're not going to discuss hockey, right? No hockey discussions.
I don't remember that agreement, but
okay.
I'll go with it.
Okay. So
bit of a sore spot this season, John.
It is. So I was a tender for a while. So I was, when I was in Russia, my coach was Tretyak. When I was there, he like skated out. And I go, and it was him. He was when I was in Russia and overseas in college. He ended up being our coach for a season, and it was unbelievable. I have one of his jerseys. I have one of his CCCP jerseys. Yeah, which is pretty.
Well, that's pretty legit. Just thank God that it was Vladislav Tretyak and not Viktor Tikhonov.
So all right, so these are all inside now. No one. I think we're the only two fans. Maybe us and like four other people. So I'll have to post the shirt. I'll have to put it on. He said, "I'll give you a jersey as long as it doesn't end up in a frame." So nice. I'll have to bust that out. But thank you so much for coming and spending the time with us. Where are you?
I'm in the nation's capital in beautiful Ottawa.
Okay. So you say nation's capital. We both thought, okay, DC. But you're in Ottawa. Okay. How cold is it there?
Today it's actually a lovely day. I mean, it's about 23 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So I don't know what that is, like 70, 74, 75.
Yeah, it's under 80.
We tend to get pretty hot summers here. So it's a bit like, it's not as bad as DC, but we tend to get fairly hot and muggy summers. So it's been a nice break. We had a lot of rain yesterday. But you know why Ottawa is the capital of Canada?
I do know that Ottawa is the capital of Canada. I'm always very proud of that when I talk with people about stuff. But I automatically just think DC. I was like, maybe because you do travel quite a bit to DC. So
I do, yeah. So I work as a senior fellow and director of one of our action teams at the Religious Freedom Institute. So in normal circumstances, I'm down there once a month. But Ottawa has been my home now exclusively for the last 8 months or so. But Ottawa was chosen as Canada's capital by Queen Victoria, really to protect us from you guys.
Well, we did burn the Parliament, right? The Parliament building once. I think it was the Green Mountain Boys, didn't they? Who is it? The Vermont Boys, didn't they rock up there and torch it? And then you guys hammered us back with the War of 1812.
Yeah, which we won.
Well, I mean, you did destroy the Capitol. I'll give you that much. But you got in Louisiana, so. The Jean Lafitte and Jackson, we did brutalize you guys after the peace treaty was signed. So,
well, but we've been on pretty good terms since the reciprocity treaty back in, what was that, the 1890s. So I know you've got this clause in your constitution where you'd always welcome us to join, but God save the Queen, and I wish you all the very best, our southern neighbors.
Well, you obviously missed the podcast where I say that I work a lot in the UK, and I do a lot of engagement with the government, and my stance is always that I'm the highest evolution of Brit as a New Yorker. So we've just, there were no Americans at the beginning of the American Revolution. They were all British citizens who the British government was oppressing. So, but I appreciate the pride, the Canadian and British pride. I have a lot of friends up there in Ottawa and Toronto and Vancouver, and I have very fond memories of being in grad school and being at Norwich University and going up to Montreal with the Le Québécois. So, yes. But like I said, we appreciate you having you on. So
thank you.
And among your credentials, we'll do a little more formal introduction here. We'll provide links aplenty in the show notes. But among other things, you have an MA in History from McGill University, a PhD in Politics from the University of Edinburgh, and you are in the spirit of the multifaith context of the Crossing Faiths podcast. I'm a Baptist, which puts me in the Protestant traditions of the Christian church, but you, sir, are an ordained deacon in the tradition called the Ukrainian Greek-Catholic Church. And so for a lot of our listeners, particularly evangelicals like me, when I first met you, that's a new sphere of Christendom to learn about. So in the context of introducing your status as a deacon in that tradition, I know without going through 2,000 years of church history, of course, kind of place yourself in the orbit of Christianity, and then kind of explain a little bit about your deacon role, because a deacon role in your status is quite different from a deacon role in my Baptist tradition. So I'll kind of let you loose on that introduction.
Sure. Well, thanks, Matt. So yes, I'm a deacon in the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic or Greek-Catholic Church. So the easiest way to understand who we are, granted, I know we're probably a bit exotic, certainly for a lot of your listeners. And so there's roughly 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. And the vast majority of those are Roman Catholics. So they're Catholics of the Roman Church of the Latin Rite. And here, when I say rite, that refers to the liturgical tradition, the spiritual life, all the things that kind of form how you worship, how you pray, how you live out your faith. Now, within that 1.2 roughly billion Catholics, there is around 20 million Catholics who are members of one of the Eastern churches. Now, these are churches that at various times have come back into communion following various schisms early in the history of the church, have come back into communion with the Roman Church and with the Bishop of Rome. So depending on how you count, it's around 21 or 22 churches. And ours is the largest of those. So the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church is around 5.5 million in the world. And we are Christians of the Byzantine Rite. So just as Roman Catholics are Christians of the Church of Rome, which was established on the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul, we are Christians of the Byzantine Rite. And so our mother church is not Rome, but New Rome, Constantinople. And so our church is founded upon the Apostle Andrew. So the roots of our church originate in Constantinople, but more specifically with the conversion of the territory of Kiev and Rus in 988. And so we are an Orthodox church. We follow all the Byzantine traditions, theology, spirituality, and so forth. And we are a church of that original Church of Kiev and Rus from the late 10th century.
Vladimir the Great.
Yeah, that's right. Vladimir the Great and Olga.
Right.
So our church, this group of Orthodox Christians that were in what is now effectively the western part of Ukraine, Belarus, and northern Romania, and in the late 16th century, after the fall of Constantinople, and that sort of break between Constantinople and its daughter church in Kiev, there's a group of these Orthodox Christians who were under the sort of, had come under the political control and the political sovereignty of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was Roman Catholic. And so there had been this kind of break with Constantinople. Moscow had risen in power, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was sort of pressing from the west, Moscow from the north. And so our church emerged in the late 16th century, 1596, through a union called the Union of Brest that brought this community of Orthodox Christians of the Kievan Church back into communion with the Bishop of Rome. And so that's our church. So the Ukrainian Greek-Catholic Church, because we're not Roman Catholics, just as not all Roman Catholics are Italians, not all Greek Catholics are Greeks. It means that we follow the Byzantine tradition. Yep. So we have a patriarch, like all the Orthodox churches. We have a patriarch who resides in Kiev, and then we have a synod of bishops. Our church is present throughout much of the world with significant populations, obviously in Ukraine, Poland, Russia, where it's effectively an underground church, and then the United States, Australia, Western Europe, Canada, and in Brazil, Argentina. So we're really now a global church, and I'm not Ukrainian in background. My background is Scottish and Irish. So we've got what the Celts share with the Slavs is really a common love of root vegetables. So we're united by that and by our love of Christ. But I grew up Roman Catholic, and then I found my way into our church when I was in my early 30s. And then I've been a deacon. I was ordained a deacon on November 30th, which is my patronal feast day. That's the feast of the Holy Apostle Andrew. So I was ordained in 2017 on November 30th. And for us, to answer the second part of your question, Matt, a deacon is the first of the major orders of clergy. So the major orders are deacon, priest, and bishop. And so a deacon is one who is called into service. So if we think about the sixth chapter of the Acts of the Apostles realized that they can't do everything. Their particular charism is to preach the gospel, but they need men of good repute who can provide sort of for the welfare of the church. Men who can serve at table, who can assist with poor relief, helping the widows, so forth. So they choose a group of men who are the first deacons. So this includes the first Christian martyr, St. Stephen. He's the first deacon. And there are others, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas. And so in the Greek New Testament, we read about these men. Their role was diakonia. So the Greek word diakonia, which is, again, this idea of being called into service. So a deacon is one who serves. Yeah. And so in the apostolic churches, all the apostolic churches have deacons, and some Protestant denominations have deacons as well. The principal role that I have is at the liturgy. So I serve at the liturgy with the priest. I'm appointed to proclaim the gospel at the liturgy, also to preach with the permission of the priest. And then deacons perform a variety of different roles within the community. So for example, in the Byzantine tradition, we talk about spiritual fatherhood. So I have some spiritual children I provide spiritual direction to. So that's part of my ministry. And then I also work with young adults. And then my religious freedom work is really also part of that role. So I see my diaconate, being a deacon, as kind of the crown on everything that I do, and it informs everything that I do, because it's all ultimately service.
Sure. And thank you for that introduction and that explanation. I think that's really helpful. And remembering back when I first met you, I think it was maybe, I don't know if the particular gathering was for your appointment, but I remember meeting you at the Canadian Embassy, and I think we ended up walking back down Pennsylvania Avenue. I think I was probably headed to the metro and you were probably headed to your hotel, but I remember that was the first conversation with you that I remember from those days. So I appreciate your friendship and collaboration in the years after that. And I know John's probably wanting to get into some policy items. So I'm about to pitch over to him, but figured I'd let you first answer how you came about getting into the role of ambassador for religious freedom for Canada, how that came about, and maybe a big lesson that you learned kind of reflecting back on that experience.
Sure. So when I completed my graduate work in the UK at the University of Edinburgh, I came back to Canada, and I was hired into the Canadian Public Service. So in Canada, we have a nonpartisan public service that is always present and doesn't change substantially when the government changes. So I started work in the Privy Council office, which you don't really have an equivalent of in the American system, but it's basically the office of public servants who assist the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to help run the government. It's a central agency, we would call it. So I was a public servant. I started in the public service in 2001 and had various roles within the public service. I then left to go into seminary and was studying theology, and then I came back into the public service. And at that time, it would have been May 2011, we had a general election in Canada, and the Conservative Party that had minority governments, where they didn't have a majority in Parliament, they were re-elected with a majority in Parliament. And so they had a very ambitious platform, including in the foreign policy space. And their principal foreign policy platform element was to establish an Office of Religious Freedom. And they had sort of seen the trends in the world. They were looking at what the Pew Forum was saying about increasing persecutions and violations of religious freedom taking place in the world. But the real, I think, catalyst for the establishment of that office was when the late Shahbaz Bhatti, former Pakistan minister for national minorities, came to Canada to talk about his role in defending the rights of minority religious communities in Pakistan. And he had a profound impact on our then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and also on a number of other ministers, including Minister Jason Kenney, who's now the Premier of the province of Alberta, but at that time he was the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. And Shahbaz Bhatti, as I'm sure many of your listeners would know, then returned to Pakistan and was assassinated.
Yeah.
And now many Catholics certainly calling for his canonization and his recognition of his martyrdom. So that encounter with Shahbaz Bhatti, I think, helped to shape this desire amongst the Conservative Party to open an Office of Religious Freedom. They're also looking at the IRF office at the State Department. They were having lots of interactions with the Americans. And so that was created. It took them a number of years, but it was eventually created in February 2013. And I was approached by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose purview it was to say, look, we've put your name forward to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to be appointed. And so I accepted the appointment. And it's very rare in the life of a public servant when you are given a brand shiny new mandate and told, here you are, Ambassador.
Go for it.
Create it. And I think, as a lot of people who are involved in international religious freedom policy will know, those offices that have been set up in various ways in different foreign ministries around the world, including the IRF office, including what the UK has done, Denmark, the Netherlands, various configurations. Typically, our foreign policy personnel, people working in foreign ministries, like many public servants, don't have a good grounding in religion and understanding the role of religion and the role that religion plays in geopolitics and so forth. Yeah. So same thing in Canada. Yeah. I wasn't a known quantity. I mean, I had some colleagues in the foreign ministry, but when I came in, I would say that a lot of my colleagues didn't really know how to relate to me, and they didn't really know how to relate to this this policy area because they'd never really done a lot of work in this area. A lot of people, I think, thought that it was kind of a partisan ploy on the part of the Conservatives to curry favor with different minority communities in the country. But I can say that when I came into that role, which I held for about 3.5 years, there was very, very next to no political interference. I acted as a public servant. I reported up, through the structure within the foreign ministry. And we did a lot of good work, I think, both in the policy area and also in programming. So the two were fused. We partnered with a variety of different organizations, everything from multilateral bodies down to small faith-based organizations to launch various projects in different parts of the world to address some of the root causes of religious persecution in areas such as education, formation of foreign policy experts. We did work in sort of post-conflict reconciliation, and we had a lot of really interesting projects in places as diverse as Myanmar, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. And then we did some really good policy work, including with our American allies. Many of your listeners probably know Rabbi David Saperstein. So David was my immediate counterpart in this work, and we worked very closely together. We had a wonderful trip to Burma where we saw the first beginnings of the grave persecution facing the Rohingya population in Rakhine State. So we worked very closely with the Americans and with our other allies. It was a Canadian initiative to create the International Contact Group on Freedom of Religion or Belief. That was established in June of 2015 at the ambassador's residence, the Canadian ambassador to the European Union's residence in Brussels, along with many of our close allies. So it was a great experience. And I would say the greatest thing that I learned from this was how religious freedom is profoundly rooted in who we are as human beings and in our inherent dignity as human beings. And religious freedom is not necessarily about the protection of the private aspects of our lives of faith, because we're always free in our inner lives of faith. Even if you're in prison, you can still continue to practice your faith, especially in the inner life. But religious freedom is fundamentally about being able to be fully who you are and who you are called to be in the public square.
Right.
And so it's about public faith. And it points directly to human dignity. Again, this ability to live out your life of faith, whether it's a specific religious belief, whether it's a philosophical belief that you have that is not specifically theistic. We all need as human beings to be able to express ourselves and to engage with others. And this is why this podcast is such a fantastic thing. We need to be engage with each other's as human beings, to recognize that dignity that we all bear, but also to recognize difference. And that we believe often very different things, sometimes deeply different things. But we need to be able to engage with one another so that we can understand one another better, but also to recognize that, yeah, we believe different things and that's okay. We don't want to sort of go down to the mushy middle where we sort of engage engage in this dishonesty where we say, well, ultimately it's all the same. It's not all the same. It's very different.
Yeah.
But what is the same is our humanity. And so how do we encounter one another in truth? And so that's why I think religious freedom is so essential for helping us to engage each other's human dignity.
Yeah, well said.
You know, I think the dignity of the human person, which I always use human dignity, but I've been borrowing Father John. So Father John Anderson, I don't know if you know Father John. So we've traveled together, and he was a guest on the podcast, and we met up in Irwin. We were in Erbil at the same time and had a conversation about it. And the dignity of the human person is a common thread that is within all faiths, and the idea that, you know, we can engage with each other, misunderstand. I always have these conversations with Matthew up there about, well, we have this little sliver about the crucifixion. You know, if we just put that aside for a minute, we can talk about everything else. You know, so, and but it gives us the opportunity for us to discuss, you know, some of the hard issues and the differences. But the fact is that he and I keep coming back because we respect each other as individuals in our faiths and who we are, and try to bring as many people into the group as possible in the podcast. And that's part of the reason why you're here, is that, you know, my tribe is going to say, okay, there's two Christians on the podcast. Like, what's the difference? What's going on? And so the description of who you are and where you came from and how you arrived at your church, but also where it resides in the pantheon of the Roman Catholic Church, and how historically there are events that have led your church to where it is. Like the second Rome, a lot of people don't know. First Rome is Rome. Second Rome, when Rome fell, was Constantinople, and then the third Rome is Moscow. Because everything went up there when it fell.
That's contested, John.
Well, I'm not gonna. Again, I don't want to commit a hate crime. I don't want you to shut off. I mean, it's why the Russian Federation and Imperial Russia had the double-headed eagle, because that was the symbols of Rome, but one of the most dynamic qualities about your career, and something that Matthew and I are very passionate about, is the practical application of faith in action. So, you know, I've spent most of my career, 20 years overseas, going to all different types of theaters, helping the most vulnerable populations on the planet, as have you. And so, so maybe unpack that a little bit. I know you're doing a lot of work in the Ukraine. I spent the last 2 years, well, not this last year, but 2 years before that, working on the conflict there, the conflict monitoring in the Donbass, and then autocephaly, and some of those issues, which I always feel very smart when I say autocephaly. So just like the word asynchronous, when I say, you know, we're speaking asynchronously, it's not bound by time or space. Anybody can go on our podcast. But when it comes to your career anchored in this practical component of faith in action and dignity of the human person, where is one of the most profound experiences you've had with that practical component? And then what are you working on now that is rooted in this concept of dignity of the human person, this faith component, and is practically being applied to, you know, work for the forces of good?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. Let me talk a little bit about maybe I'll just discuss Ukraine first, and then talk a bit about two projects, one here in Canada and then one that we're developing with the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington. So in January 2014, I was invited to join our Prime Minister and a number of my colleagues in the Foreign Service and a large sort of group of people as part of a delegation to Israel. And it was then our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper's first visit there. And it was a really, you know, impactful number of days. Both for me, it was my first trip to the Holy Land And then just to see, the interaction between the Canadian Jewish community, Israeli officials, our officials, it was really, quite something to see. Because Canada's always been a strong, well, until recently, has always been a very strong supporter of Israel. We've had a few little missteps at the UN recently. But I think that that was an amazing experience for me. But at the same time, what was happening in the world was the Maidan revolution in Kyiv was underway from late 2013 into 2014. We can all remember seeing, I'm sure, those images on television of these Ukrainians coming from all parts of the country to that square in the center of Kyiv to stand for human dignity. And this revolution has now been christened the Revolution of Human Dignity, the Revolution of Dignity. And in minus 25 degrees Celsius temperatures,
those
night
pictures
after night.
I know those pictures of the clergy standing there at night. I just remember that image, and it was an amazing moment in time where I think there was. I just remember a lot of yellow because it was the lighting was really. Whoever took the picture knew what they were doing, and the clergy were standing there, but then the crowds of people were behind them, and a number of clergy members had gone forward to step in between the government officials or riot police or whatever they were, and the people. And that symbol is a profound moment in time for the dignity of the human person, but faith leaders stepping up to participate in saying, hey, let's not oppress these protesters. Let's let them celebrate this in the way in which they should be allowed to, and that was by taking to the streets and speaking their minds. So it was a profound moment. I remember that. We'll have to post that when we see it.
Yeah, very profound. And as this was developing sort of in December and through to January, I was receiving regular phone calls and contact with one of our bishops, Bishop Ken Novakovsky, who at that time was a bishop here in Canada. He's now the Ukrainian Greek-Catholic Eparchy bishop for the United Kingdom. He's in London. And Bishop Ken was saying, you need to see what's going on. I mean, we're having liturgies, we're having prayer services, malebans, all these things just constantly going on the Maidan. And the bishops were at the front, and all the different faith communities came together. The Jewish community, the Orthodox, the different Orthodox jurisdictions, Greek Catholics, different Muslim communities, Tatar Muslims, and so forth, all coming together. And I was asked by our government to leave sunny, warm Israel, for which I did not have a winter coat, to go to Kyiv to see what was happening and to engage religious leaders on the ground in Kyiv over the space of about 72 hours. And so I flew into Kyiv, and the day I arrived was the day that the first protesters were shot by the Berkut, by the security forces. And people may recall that what happened as people were being shot, they were being taken by their fellow citizens up the hill, away from the square, to an Orthodox church and to St. Michael's Sobor, St. Michael's Church, and that basically became a field hospital. Pope Francis is famous for talking about the church as being a field hospital for the soul. This was an actual field hospital in the church during this time. And so to see religious people engaged in this justified act of protest, and to see religious leaders being present there with the people shaped me profoundly. We, as the Office of Religious Freedom, we subsequently went back to Ukraine. I was there again in October 2014. And I remember we were looking at setting up a number of projects, including one at the Ukrainian Catholic University that would bring different Ukrainian youth in particular together to talk about what does religious freedom look like in a new Ukraine. And I remember going to, we were in Lviv in Western Ukraine, and I went to the Ukrainian Greek-Catholic Seminary there to meet with some of the seminarians. And they were talking about their experience of this revolution and this idea of human dignity and how it was shaping this revolution. And I remember one of these seminarians, in the most humble way, he said, "Ambassador, are we doing the right thing?" And I was so touched by that. And I said, you are living out a vocation, a particular vocation, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe, about what does it mean to stand for human dignity in the face of oppression. And so that really shaped me, not only because I'm Ukrainian Greek-Catholic and I got to engage with sort of, our people on the ground there in Ukraine, but also to see how people from all different traditions, religious traditions, were coming together for this particular cause that was very right, despite what propaganda was saying and so forth. And there was a lot of that going around. But let me switch tracks and talk about one project that we're engaged in right now as the Caritas Religious Freedom Institute. So I divide my time currently between the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C., and Caritas, which is Canada's only faith-based think tank. And there I direct the Caritas Religious Freedom Institute. And so we've launched a project that we've actually called the Diaconia Project. So this idea of being called into service, where we are profiling 8 different faith-based initiatives across Canada in different cities doing different things in the public realm. So these are people of faith who are of their own volition. They're not being told to do this by government or by the corporate world, they do it out of their faith. They engage in projects related to refugee resettlement, to ministering to people who have left hospital and have no one to spend time with them. A wonderful Jewish organization called Ve'ahavta in the Greater Toronto region that works with the homeless. The Welcome Home in the north end of Winnipeg, a Ukrainian Greek-Catholic initiative that reaches out to urban Indigenous Canadians who are often very disadvantaged, working with them. The Union Gospel Mission in Vancouver, BC, that is reaching out to very serious problems of homelessness in the downtown east side in Vancouver. And what we want to do is to demonstrate that these people of faith from a variety of different traditions, we're actually also engaging the Ismaili Civic Initiative, which is led by the Shia Ismaili Jamaat here in Canada. Why do people of faith do what they do? And what do they do? And what is the impact that they have within communities? And so we want to kind of represent that to people, because everyone knows, I think in any city you live in, or small town, whatever, okay, if I want to put Johnny, in Boy Scouts, or Susie in the Girl Guides, I go over to, Christchurch Anglican. Or if I need to avail myself of a 12-step program, I go over to, First Presbyterian. Or if I want to, if I need a meal, I can go to the Sikh Gurdwara down the street, and they have their communal kitchen. And people know this in our communities, but what we want to do through this project is to really profile it and get policy actors to see, you need to support these groups. You don't need to give them money. Just let them do what they're going to do and make sure that they have the freedom to do what they're doing, because that is religious freedom in action. Sure. And so we wanted to profile that. So what we've done is members of these different faith-based initiatives, we've asked them to write an article that talks about who they are, what they do and why they do it. And so those will be coming out in the coming weeks. And then myself and some of our researchers are doing a bit of a deeper dive into these various initiatives and producing case studies that look at, why do they do this and how effective are they in meeting various goals. So that's the Diaconia project. The other project that I would talk about, and it probably leads in maybe to another part of the discussion I think we wanted to have, and that's something called the Brethren in the Faith Initiative at the Religious Freedom Institute in DC, and that's addressing a very serious challenge right now in the United States and Canada, and that is resurgent anti-Semitism.
Yes. Yeah, please elaborate on that for sure. I have a follow-up question, maybe if we have time. But as one who has engaged on anti-Semitism in the past, during my work with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist, and we often were looking at that. I started getting interested in it, many years ago. And probably around 2013, when people were starting to notice a resurgence and starting to measure a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe. And then only 2 or 3 short years later, we were seeing the same kind of thing here in the States. It looked a little different, but it's all the same thing. So yes, please elaborate on what your project is with regard to anti-Semitism.
Sure. Well, I think just to reiterate what you've said, Matt, and that is we've seen over the last 3 years in the United States, and certainly in Canada, but maybe not as pronounced in Canada, but certainly there's a trend of a significant uptick in anti-Semitic attacks, including violent attacks against Jews, particularly religious Jews who are very identifiable, especially in the Hasidic community in Brooklyn. We had that very unfortunate attack that took place in Monsey, not too far from where you are there, John. And then also the Tree of Life Synagogue, the attack at the Chabad Synagogue in Poway. So these are very prominent examples, but there's also a lot of other types of anti-Semitism that we're seeing, both motivated by far-right hatred, but increasingly on the far left as well. And just looking at some of the data that's out there, between sort of 2008 and 2015, 2016, the number of anti-Semitic attacks recorded averaged around, as in the United States, averaged around about between 1,100 and 1,200 per year.
Yeah.
In 2017, this shot up to just under 2,000 in 2017. In 2018, 1,900 roughly. And then in 2019, 2,100.
Wow.
And what can we attribute this to? There's probably a lot of things that we can point to, but I think there's also the character of these attacks. There's certainly what I would call kind of more traditional, very pernicious forms of anti-Semitism, where the stereotyping of Jews, their purported relationship to the world economy, these types of things that have been around for many, many decades and centuries. Various versions of, the old blood libel, all these types of pernicious forms of anti-Semitism that have always been there are kind of rearing their ugly head in various ways, especially in far-right attacks. But then on the far left, and we're seeing this in particular on campuses, both in the United States and Canada, where Jewish students are being attacked, they're being marginalized because of their support for Israel. And so you have anti-Semitism that takes the form of anti-Zionism, this idea that Israel has no right to exist, Israel has no right to defend itself, or Jews don't have the right to perform aliyah, to return to Israel. And we have to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel, like any country is subject to legitimate criticism for its policies, domestic, foreign policy, whatever. But Israel is the only country in the world that suffers this type of attack, where it's basically said, you have no right to exist. We want to wipe you off the face of the map. And that is a also very pernicious form of anti-Semitism, but it seems to be getting picked up by the left because Israel now is seen to be the oppressor. And so I think this is very problematic because of what it says about our ability to have a common life with one another. And anti-Semitism obviously has to be condemned as anti-Semitism, but it also has to be seen as a bit of a canary in the coal mine. And historically, when there's been an uptick in anti-Semitism, it usually presages an uptick in other forms of attacks against, minority communities. Certainly attacks against Muslims, now we're seeing attacks even against Catholics, churches being vandalized, statues being defaced in the United States. So, when you get into, especially there's challenging economic times, there's challenging political times, there's the look out for the scapegoat. Who can we blame for this?
Yeah, there was always an indicator for us at the American Islamic Congress. We would always watch out for anti-Semitism, and we had a very strong anti-Semitism agenda, but it was the canary in the coal mine. You knew that something was happening if anti-Semitism was on the rise, and our relationships with the Jewish community, the AJC, and all the other entities, we would always make sure we were collaborating with them. But it is an indicator, and as sad as that is to say, is that because the Jewish community is one of the most vulnerable populations on the planet, and I know we've said it in previous episodes, where the persecution means that there's an uptick in something happening, politically, religiously, something. And if you get your finger on it now, then we'll be able to stem it off, not only for the Jewish population, but for other religious populations. So it's a profound thing. I took a lot of heat for saying that when I was at AIC, to be honest with you. And I still take some heat when I was doing the anti-Semitism work and talk about Israel, because I went about a year ago. And so it's strange. It's like the balance of the existence of Israel, and we all know the strife that's going on there. And I know that my tribe is going to say, well, John, say something. Why didn't he say something about what's going? We're not saying there's not problems in the Middle East. We're not saying there's not problems with Palestine, and we all have a profound moment in time with the UAE and their historic agreement with Israel right now, which is kind of funny, because the first thing that was said to me, how come when the UAE talks with Israel, they don't get in trouble, but all the rest of us do? That was the conversation that happened actually this week. And I go, John, how could I go? Yeah, I've been hammered on it quite a bit. But I appreciate you saying that, because a lot of people don't realize that in our business, religious freedom and freedom of religion, belief, dignity of the human person, these indicators are very, very important to us. And a good example is, we were talking about Pakistan. There was the burning of Jamaat Khonas in Chitral. The Kalasha people that are being persecuted by the Pakistanis in the northern territories there, just north of Chitral, it's an indicator of how they are going to react and interact with the larger minorities. And so the anti-Semitism comment and the how the Jews are being persecuted and how that's an uptick in the numbers, we track these numbers very passionately, and then we act on them, and it's not pandering necessarily. It is about stewarding the entire religious freedom movement and making sure that our brothers and sisters, regardless of faith, are protected. So I'm sorry for the interjection, but a lot of people don't understand what that means. They go, oh, you're pandering, you're doing this, you're doing that. No, Jews should not be persecuted. Muslims shouldn't be persecuted. Christians shouldn't be persecuted.
That's right.
But the anti-Semitism component is such a concentrated indicator that we use quite a bit in Western countries. I mean, Europe and so forth. So I just wanted to kind of make sure that it made that comment interjected, and I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, no, it's an essential point, and I think a lot of people might have this sort of false understanding that, well, anti-Semitism is really it's a racism of a form. I mean, it's a racism against the Jewish people, and I would come back and say, yes, they are a nation, but they are a nation because of their relationship to God and their covenant and the Torah and so forth, and so you can't divorce the two. And when you see, outwardly religious Jews, Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn or Monsey, as I said, being attacked, it's often in synagogues or celebrating a religious feast or a religious event, and they're attacked, that is a violation of their religious freedom, very clearly. And so I think we have to be vigilant in talking about anti-Semitism in that context, and saying, yes, there is this, prejudicial kind of racist element to anti-Semitism, but it's also bound up with the faith of the Jewish people. One thing that I'll speak a little bit about what we're trying to do at RFI. Now, just to tell your listeners that the Religious Freedom Institute is a nonpartisan, non-sectarian think tank. So we don't sort of lean any particular way, politically. I'm a Canadian, so it's inside baseball for you guys. But we also don't, we have people from a variety of different religious traditions on the team. And what we wanted to do was to try and look, well, how can we as an organization that is not a Jewish organization, that is not a pro-Israel organization, what role can we play in addressing this question? Because we think we've got a unique position in that regard, because a lot of the work that's done in combating anti-Semitism, it's done by explicitly Jewish and pro-Israel organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League, the Tikva Fund, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and so forth. So what we came up with is a program, a project that we hope to launch very soon called the Brethren in the Faith Initiative. And this emerged out of a number of conversations I had with members of the Jewish community who I know and have come to be friends with. And they were all saying, well, what about Christians? Can Christians do something for us? Can they speak for us? Can they be champions for the Jewish community? And so the idea of the pastors, priests, bishops, what have you, to form them, first of all, in what is anti-Semitism, what are the different forms that it takes, how does it spread, how does it manifest itself, talk a little bit about the theology. So what is the theological basis for standing with our brothers in the faith, the Jewish people, because as Christians, and I'm sure this is the same in the Protestant tradition, Matt, but certainly in the Catholic and the Orthodox tradition, you know, we understand ourselves as the Gentiles who are grafted on to the tree of Israel.
Right.
And we acknowledge that the Jewish people are the covenanted people of Israel, and that the covenant is still in place. But we understand that, you know, Jesus Christ comes to fulfill the covenant. Not wipe it out, but fulfill it.
Yeah, fulfill it, right.
And so we have this, I think, this connection theologically, spiritually, ethically with the Jewish people. And so the thinking is that with the Brethren in the Faith Initiative is we work with Christian leaders to form them and to provide them with resources through which they can become champions for Jewish communities. And then we partner them with specific Jewish communities. And we get them to engage with rabbis. We get them to spend time in Williamsburg. We get them to spend time in Monsey. We get them to spend time with different, you know, synagogues so that they can engage the Jewish community as they live their Judaism on a day-to-day basis. And so there's the formation aspect, there's the education aspect, there's the equipping aspect, and then there's the kind of the neighborly aspect. And we hope that through this initiative, which would be a multi-year initiative, that we would then equip those Christian leaders so that they could be champions in defending the Jewish community, and to recognize that there's a theological rationale for doing that. Right. You know, I remember being at an event once, an event that was organized across North America by the Lantos Foundation, you know, named after former Congressman Tom Lantos, great defender of human rights. And Katrina Lantos Sweat, who I think we know, you know, great champion of religious freedom, you know, former chair of USERF. And Katrina and I became friends many years ago when I began this work. And they began a project called Solidarity Sabbath, where local leaders, Christian leaders, political leaders, so forth, would go to a synagogue on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, to demonstrate their solidarity with the Jewish people. So Katrina said, would you do this? And I said, absolutely. This is while I was still ambassador, and I went to a synagogue, a conservative synagogue here in Ottawa that I hadn't been to before, and I said, can I come and be with you for Friday evening prayers? And the rabbi said, sure, come on along, and we'll give you a chance to speak and talk about this project. And so I went, and in the middle of the service, the rabbi called me forward to the bima and said, okay, ambassador, what do you have to say to us? And I thought to myself, I've spoken to congregations of different Jewish congregations before about Holocaust remembrance, about anti-Semitism. And at that moment I thought, what do I say? How do I show my solidarity with them? And I recalled an incident in the life of Saint Josemaria Escriva, a Spanish priest in the early to mid 20th century, who was the founder of the Catholic movement, both lay and religious, called Opus Dei. Many people might be familiar with Opus Dei.
Yeah.
And St. Josemaria said when he was asked to explain the church's relationship to the Jewish people by a young Jewish woman at this event, he started off by saying these words. He said, "The love of my life is a Jew," referring to Jesus Christ. And so that came into my head, and I was in front of this congregation of Jews in Ottawa, and I said, "The love of my life is a Jew." And afterwards, and I kind of spoke for about 5 minutes, and afterwards people came up to me and said, "No one has ever said anything like that to us before." That's what you understand your faith as.
Right.
That you feel bound to us in this way.
Yeah.
And I said, absolutely. And so that for me is an example of how, what you're doing with this podcast and what we all need to be doing in terms of engaging people of other traditions, people who believe profoundly different things. I mean, I profoundly disagree with my rabbinical friends who reject the incarnation and the resurrection.
Right.
I think they're wrong.
Yeah.
But I also know that we share in this faith in the one God, and in this tradition of sort of ethical monotheism and so on and so forth, and that we have shared scriptures and all these things. And obviously, John, the connections that we have with the Muslim people. And so I think that was another event that demonstrated to me, this has to be at the core of how we live our lives of faith. And so I'm hoping that with the Brethren in Faith initiative, I can get other Christian leaders to make that same statement. And hopefully we can do what little we can to address this real scourge in our society of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think it's important to have innovation with anti-Semitism programming. I think that's key. We have I think there's a comfortability that happens with existing programming. This is one of my passions, is to make sure that we evaluate what's going on there, because I used to participate with women's empowerment programming and evaluation of women's empowerment programming. And sometimes they say, well, maybe we should take a look at this programming, and maybe there's a better program. And they say, well, we can't get rid of any of this women's empowerment programming because then we're against women. And I try to explain, no, let's get the money where it's going to have the most use. It's still going to be for women. Same thing with anti-Semitism and same thing with religious freedom programming, allocating the appropriate funds and in a responsible manner, but listening to something that can be innovative, that can be timely, is really profound in the moment. And it may only last for the moment. So, it might only last for while there's an increase in anti-Semitism, but it might have the impact to stem it off and then go from there. It's very meaningful for RFI and for those who don't know, Religious Freedom Institute, RFI, to be innovating down those lines. And I know that my colleagues over there, friends and that are doing stuff is Tom Farr and Jerry Barker and Ishmael and all those guys are doing stuff. They're always kind of, really kind of having these sort of sessions where I know they're thinking really hard about what can happen and how they can do it. And so we're happy that that you're not only on the podcast, but that we work very closely with the organization. But this is cool. Let's inject something new that can capitalize on the already existing structures that are out there and entities doing stuff, but reinvigorate with the same narrative, different faces, and bring some new ideas in to the idea of advocacy and protection of those who are being persecuted in the moment, so that it doesn't blossom into something very larger, and that's going to impact what's going on in the country in a positive way, and also globally set examples. Just like we were talking about you being the equivalent, the Canadian equivalent to the ambassador at large for international religious freedom. That's not by accident. It happened because we had muddled through it for so long, and then it may or may not have been it may or may not have been successful at that moment. And I'm not making a statement of whether it was, but there was wins and there were losses. but the Canadians then jumped on board to springboard that into your own. You made it your own. It was a Canadian office with the Canadian narrative, but was capitalizing on something that we were doing, and you could do things that we couldn't do. That's key. That new office and your quality of your brand of engagement and your brand of programming created a force multiplier in many ways. And there's only one ambassador Lars in America, right? So then you had another guy out there floating around and your priorities were different, and it made meaningful change and meaningful engagement. It cut your Israel trip short, but the point is like, that's the cool part of it. That's a quality that if you weren't out there doing that, who knows where you would have been, a civil servant stuck in the Canadian office somewhere. I figure out in Vancouver somewhere or way out. But the point is that in this context, when it comes to this anti-Semitic programming at RFI, it's a great moment to say, I wonder where this is going to go. And I wonder how it's going to collaborate with these different entities. And we'd love to have you on to talk about it in a future show and see what's going on. And I know Matt and I will be participating in one way or another. We'll be figuring it out. But
yeah.
Matthew?
Well, that'd be great. I mean, we're actually, if I can put in a plug here, we are still looking for funding partners for Brethren in Faith, for Brethren in the Faith Initiative. And we want to be able to partner with foundations and individuals who are also committed to this idea of bringing Christians and Jews together for this work. And so been very blessed to have a number of good meetings and encounters with different organizations, but we're looking for support for this. And I'm very excited about it, and we want other people to be excited about it. So please, God, Providence will shine on us.
So with every donation over 15 grand, Father Andrew Bennett will give you a personal blessing and a signed autographed picture of himself. That's
you'll have to forgive John. He's been tracking a little few too many prosperity gospel folks on social media lately. So
I'm on my best behavior.
Him and,
maybe an icon of the Mother of God.
What we can talk. I would love to chat with you offline about different funding and stuff like that for the program. I mean, so we can. I would work in with some of this stuff, but there might be some opportunity there. But thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, thank you for that example of an initiative. It's a one of the things. It's a kind of model that we like to highlight and talk about here on Crossing Faiths. And I think particularly on that project, you've explained why in many cases and explain the how for people who are like me, and I think I can say like you, who are theologically conservative. We believe some pretty precise things about the Bible and about the faith, and we have disagreements with those who are outside the faith, and even those within the faith, even within my own church, and I'm sure your own church, but especially in this day and age, for us to have some models of multi-faith engagement, or whatever we want to call it, for pastors and local churches in particular to reach out to communities outside of our halls of worship, and to do so in a way that harmonizes with our theology and actually expresses our faith in a coherent and faithful way, and yet treats our neighbor as we would want ourselves to be treated. So I appreciate you doing that in this particular initiative that you're launching with RFI, but also clearly it's been a pattern of your career for quite some time now. So Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, thank you once again for joining us on Crossing Faiths podcast.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks, John. It's been a blessing to be with you and a joy as well.
Appreciate you taking the time, sir.
Thank you all for watching here on YouTube, or listening, if you're listening, to the audio channels. If you've not subscribed yet to the audio channels, we're available on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Overcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and TuneIn. And this information and more is available at crossingfaiths.com. Until next time, this is Matt Hawkins and John Pinna.